Before we jump into the app, quick reminder that nothing on Bell Curve is financial advice. Everything is just a meme. Hope you guys enjoy. Huge shout out to our sponsor, Reserve. If you don't know Reserve, we're going to talk more about them later in the show. But Reserve is the easiest way to design, deploy, and govern stablecoins backed by a diverse set of assets with access to DeFi yield and insurance. Super interesting. Very excited to partner with Reserve. You'll hear more about them later in the show. Should we get into it?
Let's get into
Let's do it. All right. See you on the other side.
Welcome to another episode of Bell Curve. I've got Shreyas Hariharan and Mika Honkasalo. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Guys, we're missing Jason on this one. He said he was so intimidated by your intellectual prowess and capability. He actually couldn't poor guy, he woke up with without his voice, so we're going to do our best to soldier on without him today. We got a great episode for everyone. We've got a lot, frankly, to unpack, and I'd love to get into as much of it as we have time for. Shreyas, I actually want to turn this over to you. You have this great analogy of kind of Coase's theorem, right? And kind of this theory of the firm and how that might translate into the new world of DAO. So yeah, I saw you gave a talk at Mainnet. Can you kind of just unpack your ideas there?
Yeah, for sure. So the basic idea that Ronald Coase, who was an economist in the 1930s, worked on is the theory of the firm, which is he asked this question of why does the firm exist? Why can't individuals, say at Ford Motor Company, whether it's the engineers or the designers or the executives, just work as independent freelancers? And why do they have to come together as a firm to sell their services? And the reason is because firms reduce transaction costs. And so firms actually, there's a lot of costs incurred when individuals sell their services independently in the free market. And specifically, there's three types of costs. One is triangulation, which is finding and measuring the quality of a service. The second is transfer, which is it costs a lot to bargain and negotiate for a specific service. And so if you have an individual every day who's trying to negotiate how much they're supposed to get paid and what the contract should be, that would be quite costly. And then lastly, trust, which is the party may not be trustworthy, and you can have usually you have the legal system that comes as a last sort of option of recourse, but legal system itself is expensive, and so firms really help reduce these transaction costs, which is why individuals work at firms. And then the internet has helped reduce transaction costs significantly, and so by individuals being able to directly work for services that other individuals demand. It's reduced transaction costs. So for one example would be Uber, where drivers are able to sell their services and find riders, and of course you have the app that mediates that, but that's very different from having a taxi medallion that mediates it. And then same with Airbnb, same with other like gig economy type freelance design services. And so this, DAOs or blockchains are in that, wave of helping reduce coordination costs, where you have this system, you have kind of Ethereum, let's say, that really helps have those nation state type properties of contract enforcement that can help, people from around the world, whether it's, from different countries or in some cases, anonymous people really trust each other. And then you have these individuals that can, sell their services directly because they have some shared, level of sort of contract enforcement or trust that, mediates that. And yeah, my argument in that post was that while transaction costs have reduced, there reaches a point where, individuals, and we're seeing this with contributing to protocols, where it is hard for individuals to contribute to protocols directly because there's a lot of cost involved in coordinating sort of different skill sets, whether it's smart contract engineering or governance work. There's bargaining power and even like passing a governance proposal. And so, there are DAOs, these collectives that come together to even contribute to protocols that, make the contribution even more effective and impactful. And so the idea is that it's almost like you've had this unbundling of labor, and then now you're kind of having a rebundling, but that's emerging more slowly. through DAOs and especially DAOs that contribute to protocols.
Yeah, it's funny to look at DAOs through the lens of Coase, right? The Coase's theorem, because if you look at a company and the aim of reducing transaction costs, you look at something like trust, like, hey, you both work here, so you trust, right? Triangulation, right? You don't have to go out and find the service like it's the guy sitting next to you or the San Francisco office or whatever. So you can see through kind of traditional corporations in America how they've improved efficiency through basically just this kind of top-down hierarchical rigid organization. Maybe the next evolution of that is the internet, where you're not all necessarily working for the same firm, but like Uber drivers, right? As an example of like, okay, we're both on this app and we don't necessarily need to trust each other. I can very easily find you. When you look at DAOs, and Shreyas, I know you were sort of talking about this specific subset, contributor DAOs, in your talk, but it was interesting to look at it through this lens because I think in some instances it's almost like we're going one step back, right, for Coase's theorem, because even if you look at a lot of these DAOs that are trying to now recruit services, it's like, hey, let's just RFP out every single minor service, right, in some instances. And that just seems to create a lot of like friction. So I guess, Mika, maybe as a kind of avid DAO contributor, maybe you could address some of that point and how you see all this.
I do think that, like in crypto, sometimes there is this thing, are we building something new or are we like building existing things over again on the internet? And when it comes to like how to set up working organizations towards like building actually some useful product or service, I think the baseline is sort of we do start from a reset in a way, and that's where like a lot of this comes from, and people are sort of discovering a lot like, okay, how should we like set up like this organization and how do we accomplish this goal? I think in practice, like for example, I've been like a delegate on MakerDAO, and the sort of least impressive part of MakerDAO is probably the DAO part in terms of how well it sort of organizes itself. So there is like a lot of skepticism around that, but I think it's more of a process question where we reset and we get to like try these things in a global and sort of pseudonymous way, and or potentially at least it's sort of up to the market to decide, and that's sort of what opens up like I think the kind of cool stuff and eventually like leads to better outcomes. But it's just within like working in that environment, it just looks a bit more hectic on a day-to-day basis.
A question that I would put to you guys is, I sort of, it seems to me sometimes I hear DAOs get talked about in two different ways, right? Which is, one, we are going to sort of reinvent the theory of what the firm should look like, right? And in general, it obviously differs on a DAO to DAO type basis, but in general, we want something that looks less like a rigid hierarchical structure. We want a flat organization, something that looks more like a democratic form of governance internally, right? Where contributors get more of a voice than necessarily just top-down management. On the other hand, Shreyas, I was kind of struck by listening to your talk and description of DAOs. In a lot of ways, it's almost the continuation of many trends that we currently see, right? Like the gig economy, first of all, like a global employee and contributor base, right? Everything kind of takes place online. So I guess like those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive ideas, but in order for, let's say, like protocol DAOs or contributor DAOs, as opposed to, I guess you'd call Bitcoin or Ethereum a DAO, but like let's focus specifically on, hyperstructure protocol type DAOs. Do you think we need to like totally tear everything up at the roots and reinvent it? Can governance actually be this governance that we're experimenting with, that be an advantage? Or do you see it kind of as the natural continuation of trends that are already occurring in, let's say, the tech industry?
Yeah, I think there's always a combination of both. I think the unique things that blockchains and crypto enable, one is that you take a simple thing that anyone can create an Ethereum address, and anyone can create multiple or several hundred Ethereum addresses. That's a very unique property of blockchains, that you could have these hundreds of pseudonymous identities. Each of them could be transacting, contributing to different protocols, engaging with different protocols as a user. And it's just so different from a real identity in a nation state where you have one identity linked to one person. And so, yeah, I just picked that as one example of something that is distinct about blockchain. So you can have, I think you like many DAOs need to have more elements of corporate governance, especially things on maybe like the idea of an independent board that reviews the compensation of a CEO. Like that's a useful idea. But then you have these unique elements, which is anyone can contribute to a DAO. In some cases, you have several pseudonymous contributors who don't know each other. In some cases, you don't know who they are. you can also I think you kind of have to lean into the fact that that the DAO native way of contributing is different in the sense that there is more churn in the contributors, and so you have someone who contributes for a few months in one protocol, contributes to another protocol for a few months, and so I think yeah, you always want combinations of both. So I mean, to summarize, I would say you need, so let's take Aave as an example. So Aave is a lending protocol. Aave, I would say, has like maybe one of the more functional like DeFi DAOs that exist today. And so there's a core protocol that is built by Aave companies that is the liquidity protocol that all the users use. And Aave builds V1, V2, V3, does the major innovations on what the protocol needs. And then you have this large surface area for governance and for the DAO. And so that surface area includes risk parameter updates, asset listings, what assets should be listed on Aave, treasury allocations, how the treasury should be allocated, the safety module, which is Aave has this insurance fund and how the insurance fund needs to be adjusted to reflect the growing needs of the protocol. Grants and like sort of funding incentives for people to build on top of Aave. And so there are these host of functions that the Aave sort of companies, the centralized team is not working on, that clearly the DAO is doing. And there's some things that can happen in a sub-DAO model. So like, it's almost like a unit of the DAO. And so Aave grants DAO functions like that. But there's some things that is just much better as a service provider. So you have, say, Gauntlet or Llama or Chaos Labs that serve Aave DAO with specific services, and it's just way better because they compound expertise from working across several DAOs to provide Aave with a useful service. So I think you kind of need a combination of different things, and I think the unique thing that DAOs enable is that anyone can theoretically contribute. But like I found out before, there are some constraints in that, like these things that anyone can theoretically say like get a government contract or something, right? But in reality, there's a lot of constraints that prevent people from doing that, and we need to ease that access better, but also make sure the quality of the work and contributions remain high.
It depends a lot, I think, also on the task at hand that's being performed, what kind of DAO structure is good, because you can think like Ethereum is kind of like this big ship. If there would be like sort of real governance decision making in that, I don't think that like creates an optimal outcome actually, and like it's better than, and also people I think like just generally in an informal way agree what the roadmap should be, and let's just work like very deliberately toward that. There's something like Uniswap as well. It's kind of like an order book, and you just trade on there. It doesn't actually need that much stuff. But like the Aave example explained here, and like the Maker one, I would rather let computers do everything, right? But as long as they can't, like you need a human kind of doing those parameter updates, and that's where you kind of need governance, because the task is more complex than like matching orders in a way. Like actually setting interest rates and things like that is not like a trivial task even in Maker. You actually need someone to do it. And I think like also an underestimated part is that people do have an opportunity to contribute anonymously or pseudonymously to like these projects. There is like I think a lack of like really high end like work always, and if you're able to do that, I think you're always able to make your way to like the top of, or like to an important place in terms of like working on like Aave interest rates or something like that, because like it's so few people actually do that very well. So
yeah, I think that's I really like that point, because Ethereum is a great example of you don't need on-chain governance for everything. Ethereum functions well, and there's governance is basically decision making, and it's almost, I view it as like blockchains and DAOs. It's like an extension of social networks, which is social networks help people maybe communicate with each other, but the point of maybe DAO governance is that you combine that communication with real coordination and decision-making power, where there's structures that people can make decisions, and the structures need not be sort of on-chain governance or token holder voting, right? They could really differ based on what the needs of the protocol are, and also even within the on-chain governance, Uniswap is much more a hyperstructure that has just a need for governance for the fee switch and treasury allocation. versus Aave has, a much bigger mandate because of the sort of risk side.
We've talked about that, this idea, even in past episodes, with Hasu and Chris in episode 1 of this season, this kind of idea that there are different governance structures that are appropriate for different layers, let's say, of like however close a protocol is to let's call it the base infrastructure layer of crypto, right? So let's say for something like Bitcoin or Ethereum, like governance, because there is some governance, right? There are EIPs, right? Like we implemented EIP 1559 this year. That was there are changes that are being made there, right? There's ultimately, like, to your point, there's a roadmap that's being aligned on, but it's kind of it's this big barge, right? That's very hard to move in one direction or another. And that's probably more of a feature than a bug. Then you could kind of go one layer up, right? And then maybe there's something like an Aave or Compound or Maker. Those are like very base layer infrastructure things. And then you can kind of go all the way up the stack to more consumer facing applications. So what are your sort of thoughts on different governance structures that are appropriate? Do you think it should be kind of bigger and more democratic at the base, the infrastructure layer, so things are harder to make quick changes to, and maybe more nimble at the top? Or how would you think about, prescribing different types of governance to different parts of the stack?
I like a very clear separation where if you have things that need to be done, that part I think should be done by people who are really invested and aligned with the project. And then the base layer infrastructure, especially over time, things like Aave and Maker more and more will reach that kind of Ethereum status to me, where I just think of them as kind of natural monopolies that can form very well, and they're kind of like the big energy companies that are almost nationalized by nation states and things like that. That to me is all an analogy, and the way that they sort of the business operates. In some of those cases, Ethereum at end state is kind of like a business that any idiot can, in a way, operate, because it just runs and makes money forever. It's like digging oil from the ground. It doesn't at that point, when you reach that sort of real level of maturation, I think it looks like that, as a business. So in that sense, I don't think it needs to be touched anymore. The same way the core internet protocols don't get to email doesn't really get touched in that way. So I think there you really want to over time reach that, and then when you're doing something very specific, that's where it helps to be much more concentrated. But also you can think all the organizations on top of Ethereum are kind of sub-DAOs of that in a way, because they're using that infrastructure, building their own thing, utilizing and taking advantage of Ethereum's properties. They just have their own governance model on top, and their own sort of rent and value extraction. But it's just the more consumer facing you are and the more nimble you have to be, the more you are less of a DAO. And then over time, I think all DAOs sort of should get dissolved in a way where it just runs on pure math, the whole thing.
I'm going to make maybe a weird analogy here that might be a bit of a reach, but sort of bear with me. One big topic, especially let's say in the case of something like Lido, an advantage that DAOs can do that it would have been much more difficult to do in the real world is to ossify certain things in code, right? Make it immutable so that you can't necessarily change it. If you think about it, if you think about the governance of the United States, right, what we've basically did, we kind of forked different ideas in the past, right? There was the Magna Carta, right, which was kind of Commonwealth law in the UK, and the Republican sort of structure back in ancient Rome. And we took a bunch of that and we created this thing called the Constitution. And then we sort of ossified it. We made it very difficult to change what that ultimately is, right? You can do it if you get a super majority. We added Bill of Rights and all that kind of stuff. But we almost enshrined this thing right at the beginning of the United States. And I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with this kind of idea that ultimately property law, strong property law enforced by the state, is a huge determinant for what ultimately makes something successful or not. But I kind of believe that, right? Because build a company in the United States as opposed to other countries, because we know that the government isn't necessarily going to come in here and take it all, right? There's that kind of certainty. So I'd be curious how good of a job you think DAOs right now are doing at creating that same sense of certainty, right? There are a couple of examples where that hasn't necessarily been the case, but if you call Ethereum a DAO, I think they've done a pretty good job of that. But I'd be curious about some of the other DAOs, how immutable that the state that they're creating. How good of a job do you think they're doing?
Yeah, I think the that analogy of the Constitution should maybe apply to the blockchain, to layer one blockchains. And so I think like Ethereum, it should be changeable but hard to change, like the Constitution. And and it is in blockchains though it's easier to change in the sense that well if it may be hard to do an EIP process, but maybe you could fork Ethereum, you could start your own blockchain. Now it's hard to get adoption in that case, but it is difficult to start a country with your own constitution. The barriers to entries are much harder than higher than the barriers to entry to start your own blockchain. I think the now, protocols and DAOs that are built on blockchains inherit some of the properties of blockchains, but they don't need to resemble the same level of, uh, yeah, like, the, in some cases they could be like unchangeable, completely immutable. In some cases they can have much more flexibility. I think in, say lending protocols, there should be some room for, the changing nature of DeFi and markets versus yeah maybe in AMM like yeah maybe Uniswap V4 after once if they launch it, like that is kind of a that maybe I don't think so, but maybe that's it, and then you just need like minor upgrades on top of it. But maybe that doesn't apply to say lending protocols. I think and so yeah, it just depends on what the application is. I think if you do stick to a specific uh, if you do stick to remaining relatively immutable, where yes, it's possible to change, but you're having an opinion. Let's say like Nouns, for example, has this one auction every day forever, and people bid on that auction, and the proceeds go to the treasury and then is allocated to fund projects that build on Nouns. That's an opinion. Like they could maybe have 20 auctions in a day. They could maybe have one auction every month. But the protocol has an opinion, which is they're doing one auction a day forever, and that's what's said, and that's like the social consensus. There's a way to change the protocol, and you could really increase the auction speed or decrease it. Let's say there's no demand for Nouns auctions. Will they make it one a month? I don't know, but like it's more interesting when it's just like sticks to one a day, and then maybe you have forks of Nouns that experiment with different auction frequencies. And so I think there is something special to this community building. This is almost a little bit like the autonomous nature of the DAO, which is the protocol does have these rules that are are opinionated and are specific, and there's some social consensus that it's going to just run forever. And it attracts this community of contributors or users and builders that are attracted to that particular mission and that opinion. And if people really oppose that, that instantiation of the protocol, you could of course fork it and have your own experiments to run with.
To me, it's very much dependent on just the business you're in, and like the business you're in kind of dictates it's where you can think like MakerDAO has two ways to go about this. You can just try to be like super decentralized and try to survive, and maybe that's the right way to become like the most important global infrastructure and an important stablecoin. But the other one, which forces you to take risk and forces you to govern things, is if you want to generate yield off chain, for example. But that does give you like the advantage of capital efficiency, being able to put that capital you make off chain into like on chain vaults that increases your competitiveness. So the good part about forking is exactly that you get to like try out every variation of this. But I think it depends on the business you're in a little bit, where it could be where the right way to go about Maker from now on is to be very, very conservative, or it could be that right now the best way is to get all the off-chain stuff, put yield sources in, and really like push the capital efficiency and make DAI more attractive to hold, and that's what wins you the game. So I think like it very much depends on just the market forces you in a sense to do different things.
Mika, maybe we could start to get into some tangible examples here, like moving from the kind of high level theoretical down into what's actually happening on the day to day. Maybe we could actually start with Maker, because Maker in many ways is kind of a bellwether. So I think the first, maybe you could call it like consequential DAO if you don't include something like Bitcoin or Ethereum. Can you actually just describe for listeners who might just kind of know what Maker is, understand what Maker the token is versus DAI, but like, can you just describe Maker as an entity? Like if you were describing a business like Amazon, you say it's a shipper, right? It provides AWS, like these are its customers, this is how it makes money. Could you kind of give us an overview of Maker and how it all works, and then we can get into the governance.
I think for the purposes of understanding it, like as a business, it's very much like a flat organization with like different parts. I'm not describing like the old version of Maker. The new version is sort of more eccentric, but before that comes, let's just talk about how it's been. It's like a flat organization with like core units who are often responsible for like a specific thing. Those core units are made up of like a certain number of people, for example, engineers, and then they have like a facilitator who sort of, in a way, tries to answer to MKR token holders. So that's one part of the equation. The second part is you have delegates who basically vote on everything related to money and how risk is handled within the system. So it's about how budgets are allocated, how different risk parameters around debt ceilings are set, and then like there are token holders, not very many, but like token holders who have delegated their tokens to these delegates who then like approve or disapprove basically how budgets are allocated and how risk is managed within the system.
So that's kind of the governance structure. What are all of those different pieces trying to achieve, right? I know at a high level it's kind of the perpetuation of the stablecoin DAI, but what if you sort of went around and polled all these different stakeholders within the organization? What would they say the objective is?
So that's the funny and sort of worrying part in some sense in Maker nowadays, which is that people will probably give you different answers to that question. Some people are much more heavily want a certain type of growth strategy and another want like another. So it can be as simple as what should the interest rates be, like how competitive should you make them in a bull market to encourage like leverage from the system, to all the way to the like the baseline philosophy of do you have real world assets as collateral or not. And like that's like a point of friction and actually probably gets you like quite a bit of like different answers, and ultimately it's like a democratic vote in a way of those people who, or those tokens that show up via delegates or themselves, like the majority always kind of wins. So it's like a democracy in that way. It is kind of like a slow moving entity in that way, where you get like decisions that are kind of you tend to get decisions that are kind of conservative. And it's good that, like, for example, in the bull market, like people didn't take like UST, for example, as collateral and things like that. So there's been like sensible decision making. So I think it is like there's like some good parts to it, but there's also some bad parts to it, where also the DAO tends to like ossify around like certain people, and in practice you do tend to get like this effect where a few people are very much like sort of the key decision makers in the system, and that's not necessarily bad, but it's just like a reality as well. So I think there's probably like more complexity on the organizational side that's kind of necessary in that way relative to like what's actually being done. So it is kind of complicated, but it is also very cool in a way, because you do have like different kinds of people from all sorts of different backgrounds like bringing new ideas to the table, and those do have a good chance of getting implemented if they're good. So there's a lot of positives as well.
All right, everyone, brief break in the show here to talk about our newest sponsor, Reserve. So, it's looking pretty bleak out there. It's not looking that great. We know what the one thing there's no bear market in?
Stable coins.
Stables, baby. Stables. We love those stable coins, which is why we're excited to partner with Reserve Protocol. So let's just start with the basics. What is Reserve? It's a self-service platform to build, deploy, and govern asset-backed stablecoins, which can be integrated with DeFi or within the real economy. So the cool thing about Reserve is basically anyone out there permissionlessly can take any set of ERC20 tokens and use them to collateralize their own stablecoin. So the long-term goal of the Reserve protocol is to create a non-inflationary currency that is stable on a month-to-month basis, but also a century-to-century basis. In the meantime, though, they're open sourcing design decisions for stablecoins, which is just super, super cool. I think one of the benefits that you get there is diversification. You hear it all the time in Finance 101, no such thing as a free lunch except for diversification. That's what you're getting with Reserve Protocol.
Yeah, I've known the team for a long time. I spoke on a panel at SF Blockchain Week with Nevin, with Joe Carlson and Alex Gladstein. Really impressive growth that they've been able to have so far, right? Their premier stablecoin is RSV. It is backed by 3 other stables. It's already used by over 500,000 people, transacting over $300 million a month. Right now, like Mike was talking about, anyone can go create a custom bespoke stablecoin using the Reserve protocol. You can back it by maybe specific USD stables, or you can get creative and maybe build something more complex like inversely correlated assets. The branding, governance, and composition are completely up to you.
And lastly, if there are any builders who are listening and you aren't interested in issuing your own stablecoin, what you can do is you can stake Reserve's governance token against your favorite stable strategies. So what you're doing there is you're providing backstop insurance to stablecoin holders. Not riskless, right? Not financial advice. There's definitely some risk in doing that, but it does allow you to earn yield, especially now in crypto when there are so few ways to do that. It's definitely worth checking out. So at the very least, you should click the link at the bottom of this episode. Go check out the Reserve website. See all the cool stuff they're up to. Most importantly, though, click this link. You got to give Jason and me some credit here.
Show us some love. Show us some love.
Give us some love, baby. Give us some love. All right. Now back to the show.
Let's get into it.
There are kind of like three large sets of stakeholders in Maker, right? There are the core units. Then there's also the delegates. And then there are kind of token holders, right? And one of the benefits, it's like one of the maybe the cons of an organization like that is there's a lot of friction sometimes, and people aren't necessarily aligned on one goal. So sometimes it feels like, hey, we could be sprinting faster here if we all just got on the same page. That's what the goal kind of is at a startup. But on the other hand, it seems like it functions as this sort of checks and balances type system, right? Where actually moving slower can be a feature, not a bug in some instances. Maybe the case of like not accepting UST as collateral is quite a good one, right? Because I would imagine that would have been very damaging to the Maker protocol. So maybe like with that particular frame of governance in mind, like let's move to another kind of base layer protocol, something like Uniswap, right? Which my understanding of Uniswap is there's the Uniswap Labs, which sort of builds consumer-facing products on top of the protocol. Then there's the recently formed Uniswap Foundation, which manages updates to the actual protocol. So I'd be curious, like if you take a look at these two forms of governance, like is the governance structure that Maker has necessarily applicable to Uniswap? Is it not mixing? Could you not just copy pasta it over to this new protocol? And if not, why?
Yeah, I think for Uniswap, how Uniswap is so different is that the AMMs, like just by the nature of what they are, like require much less governance. There's just way less surface area for what token holders and what contributors should do. The main, so right now how Uniswap governance structure, like there's just two main things that governance needs to do. One, it can allocate the treasury. So right now it's allocated the treasury to different initiatives, to the DeFi education fund that funds the sort of legal and policy initiatives for DeFi, to grants programs, and then now the Uniswap Foundation. And it can sort of allocate the treasury. And then two, there's the fee switch, which is a Uniswap DAO can start earning revenue. And maybe once the fee switch happens, then it results in other questions, because you have a bunch of, right now the Uniswap treasury is just uni tokens, but then if there are other assets that go to the Uniswap treasury, then there's more room for governance, because you decide what to do with those assets. Maybe there's a treasury management question, maybe there's a question of how do you use those assets in governance of other protocols. But even in its maximum state, like there doesn't seem to be as much need for governance. And so I think the goals of Uniswap, it should be to attract sort of developers and front ends to bring liquidity to the protocol. And it's interesting because the labs entity is sort of building products on Uniswap and is no longer kind of growing and maintaining the protocol. The foundation is now taking charge of that. And so there's this question of does the foundation just do minor upgrades to the protocol? Will the foundation build come up with sort of new fresh innovations, and is that the right structure to incentivize some of the top sort of smart contract developers to engineer major innovations in the MM model? I mean, that's yet to be seen, but I think the basic idea kind of works fine. Like there's always questions that Uniswap governance is it's a little different from Maker, which is Maker. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different stakeholders. It's quite messy. Uniswap, it's more, there's not much going on, and I think it's a little bit of a function of the MM doesn't need sort of too much.
Yeah, I think just what kind of structure I would want actually for Uniswap is like the labs entity, and Uniswap Labs really has an incentive to grow the protocol just by the virtue of them having a lot of uni on their balance sheet and them being founders of the project. And I do find that the problem with grants programs and things like that so far has been that you're not really able to produce those sort of long-term results where someone is really incentivized to build their business on top of Uniswap. So like the kind of ideal case you'd want actually is, okay, someone like taking the Uniswap protocol, really putting a lot of effort into building a new type of business on top of the protocol, for example, like perpetual swaps or something like that, and really making that their own thing and being able to be rewarded in Uni in a way for that effort, and actually becoming like a second labs entity that's on top of the protocol that does as much good for the protocol almost as the labs entity does. Like if I think protocols have been sort of poor at managing sort of their token table, cap table, and really incentivizing this kind of action. But that's the kind of thing you'd ideally, I think, to me, like to see, because otherwise it's just the labs entity doing its thing and the Uniswap token holders thinking whether or not it's okay to turn on the fee switch, which is kind of like an uncreative way. But if you could really have like another like tip of the spear pushing things forward, that's the kind of outcome you'd really want. And maybe the foundation can do it then.
Actually, a good example of a second labs entity in Aave, there's BGD Labs, which consists of some core members of the Aave original Aave Genesis team, including the CTO, who then left Aave companies and is getting funded by the DAO to work in core protocol development. And so yeah, there's at least one instance of people who have a lot of context in the protocol and are motivated to build for it, but are getting now funded by the DAO, because it is a different approach to build products on the protocol versus focus on new protocol innovation.
I have a question about something like that. So, I mean, if you think about, again, maybe this is oversimplifying it, but using the analogy of like a firm or something like that. Let's say like a firm wants to embark on a new area of business, right? Like let's say Blockworks, we've got, to use an example, we're a media company, but now we've got research as well. So right now it's like, okay, we got to figure out, in addition to media, how to sell research. It's a little funny to kind of hear the CTOs like, oh, I'm going to leave Aave companies and start my own thing that leverages this. Because instead of like in a firm, right, going back to Coase and reducing transaction costs, you're like, hey, it's your job. You're already employed here. Like, let's go figure out how to do this. There's no additional costs or friction. But now it's like every time there's a new thing, someone come disband from the entity, leverage, what's already been built and be like, I want equity in this new thing that I'm building. Do you kind of see from that lens, it might actually increase transaction costs?
I think the reason is because the protocol is different in the sense that it's like products on protocols, like the building Uniswap v3 and v4 is different from building a wallet, right? And so I think you kind of you could like all that's equal if there were no regulatory hurdles or if there were no other issues. Like I think the right structure is you have everyone in that same team that's both building the protocol, building products in the protocols. You're thinking about both, in the same way. You ideally don't even have equity. You just have everyone has token ownership, and there's nothing else. There's no one equity, one token that leads to
different
incentives. That's I think the ideal case. There are a lot of constraints that prevent that from happening, and so I think the second approach does make sense, but which is you have people who are funded by the DAO to maintain and upgrade the protocol. They can stay in the labs team, but if the labs team is focusing more going forward on building products that is kind of just different from the core protocol maintenance and development. The core labs team also has equity. There's sort of a different there could be situations where the token does well and the equity doesn't do well. The equity does well, the token doesn't well. And I think you're kind of having a different bet when you're getting funded by the DAO to maintain and upgrade the protocol.
Let's talk a little bit about this idea of value creation versus value capture in DAOs. Shreyas, I saw you shared an article the other day, and I thought it was quite interesting. Basically, to summarize for the audience, just because you create something of value doesn't necessarily mean you can capture that value, right? Like maybe the most classic example is something like a Wikipedia, right? I think I use Wikipedia a shocking amount in my day-to-day life, actually. I even do it on weekends. Sometimes go down little Wikipedia rabbit holes, and it's like very entertaining for me. I think humanity as a whole probably gets an enormous amount of use out of Wikipedia the effect to which that value that Wikipedia has created has been captured by the creators of it that's where it's a little bit thinner. I don't know, Shreyas, if you want to maybe take a swing at summarizing this particular article. We'll link to it in the show notes, but you want to take a swing at?
Yeah, I can share some of my thoughts. I've been thinking about this for some time, and then Brano shared a really good post, and some of it overlaps with what he shared too. I think so firstly, like the because of the nature of open source protocols and the fact that you don't have there's a lot of things that how companies capture value that is driven by the fact that there's either proprietary data, or there's a proprietary algorithm, or there's or the sort of the source code is proprietary, and open source protocols, by default you don't have any of that, and so right now the main things that have accrued value is that the main token model that probably that makes sense right now, like that clearly works, is Ethereum. Like I think the the layer one chains and like the proof of stake model, like that kind of makes some sense, like it's like versus really anything else. And like you probably have then things like maybe Aave and Maker that fall probably in between, where it makes more sense than say something like Uniswap, but it still is not proven yet. And I think so the few things, like one is this question of revenue. So like let's take Uniswap, right? Like Uniswap is an open source protocol that has there's always this debate of can it turn on fees, and you have the fee switch that can bring revenue to the DAO. You could do that, but in reality, most of the a lot of the revenue could actually come from products built on top of the protocol, can come from maybe payments from order flow. This is how folks like Robinhood and other wallets and exchanges will make money, and so that is a way more sustainable revenue source than maybe the fee switch, though the fee switch could bring quite a bit of revenue to the DAO. And also there's always a sense that if you can't keep increasing prices, because at some point there's the switching costs when you have open source protocols competing with each other is just much lower. And so I think I think one idea that I have is you kind of almost want a more unique way to capture value to these protocols. And this is thinking a little bit out of the box here, but you almost there's a good post by someone from Nouns who talked about NFTs as provenance rights. And so maybe an analogy, if you think about Uniswap, if they, let's say, didn't have any ERC20 tokens, but instead you just had NFTs that were issued, you just had socks or some other NFT collection, or you had continuous auction NFTs, something that people could own that had provenance rights over the underlying protocol. That maybe is interesting, which is Uniswap is a culturally significant protocol, and therefore people are owning these assets that have this cultural significance, and maybe there's demand for that. Still an open question as to how many people would demand that, whether that's valuable and all that. But that maybe is interesting as well, where the open source protocol itself doesn't try to capture fees in the traditional way, but there's other ways that it can have sort of status and provenance rights, and other individuals or rich people can maybe have some ownership over funding these projects. It's a possibility too, but yeah, by default, sort of products Web2 products just have a way easier value capture methodology than open source protocols.
I do think sometimes we maybe overthink the sort of value capture bit, in the sense where Uniswap token holders, like uni holders, their incentive is to maximize profit seeking from the system. That's what they would ultimately like to do. But Uniswap as a business may be one where the margins are just very small, but that's not that different from just how technology improves people's lives. Your distribution, your overall volume gets higher, but you're kind of your cut gets smaller, and the efficiency of your business is much higher. You can think Uniswap versus New York Stock Exchange. like Uniswap is like the open version that the whole world can use. Maybe it becomes bigger than the New York Stock Exchange, and maybe like the cut you're able to get is not as big as the New York Stock Exchange because of like regulatory reasons, because of like forking and competitiveness. But there is like also some switching cost involved on migrating that liquidity, where the liquidity on Uniswap is not that sensitive to like some fee level, and you're able to like get that fee level, and that's how it ultimately plays out. Also, like these kinds of businesses, it's very hard to know, and this like I think comes to the NFT point in a way, what the monetization methods are ultimately and how good or bad they are, because something like Google didn't make money until it made money, right? And I think a lot of these businesses kind of could be similar, where you can intellectualize all you want about what the Uniswap fee switch should be, but ultimately if the product suite is really large, a lot of it gets decentralized over time. Maybe there is like some amazing value capture there over time, and that's how it just plays out. But it again, I think, depends a lot of the business you're in and the switching costs, where like, well, how like if I put the fee up by whatever basis points on Uniswap, like is the liquidity gone or not? And if it is, like all the exchange aggregators will navigate to that, but the Uniswap front end won't, and that has like its own stickiness and a lot of users. So I think it's the a very like traditional business thinking does apply to like something like the Uniswap fee switch, for example.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, the limits to which it probably isn't so black. Like there aren't an enormous amount of instances of forking really that are like very successful, right? Like if you kind of look, I guess SushiSwap is like the big one that is still kind of playing out in real time, and like Lord knows they've gone through their struggles with leadership and everything over there, but it doesn't seem like there are that many instances of forking purely with eliminating a cost and taking an enormous percentage of the user base. And when I kind of think back to like an analogy of like I am a customer at Bank of America and Fidelity. Why? Because when I was in like high school, I got dumped into those bank institutions. And even though Robinhood had no trading services for a long period of time, I still kept my stuff on Fidelity. Why? Because it was like kind of a pain in the ass to move everything, and I just didn't really want to do it. So I know if it was $100 for every trade on Fidelity, I probably would have moved that. But it's $5 a trade, and it was like, is it really worth it? So I wonder if there's some element of that within crypto as well, where there's a sensitivity barrier maybe for forking.
I think that, yeah, I do think there's totally a like a safety what's the word for it, that you just don't move things when you're, but like, you kind of, the B2B equivalent is you don't get fired for using IBM. Like I think there's definitely that on the consumer side, which is why trusted brands have a lot of value, and you don't Coinbase works and people don't switch from Coinbase. I agree with all that. I think that's at the product level though, and that's different from the protocol. So I think you want to own the end customer relationship. Then you want to have. So I do think Uniswap's like wallet or the thing that owns the end customer relationship totally will have, if it's good, if it's as good as Coinbase or Fidelity or Robinhood or whatever, like will have that trust with consumers, and can have that retention. And if it satisfies those needs of users, I agree. Like people are not, there's very few people that are super DeFi native and picky, but that's kind of different from the protocol, because the protocol almost exists in the middle, right? So I think it's in this weird point, because these DeFi protocols, on the one side you have infrastructure that's really costly, that's hard to build, but once it's built, it's hard to displace, which is something like Ethereum. On the other side, you have things that really have the end customer relationship, like the Uniswap front end, probably is an example, but yeah, like wallets and Coinbase and things like that have the end customer relationship. Again, is hard to displace because people don't like to move. And then in the middle, you have these protocols, and I think these protocols have to move to one side or the other to become, in some cases they have to vertically integrate, like DYDX is building its own chain, or they have to do both, sort of vertically integrate to build a wallet and have the end customer relationship, or they have to do both. But the core, again, we're just talking about the core protocol, like, and if you separate the protocol from the product, like I think that's where it becomes harder, and you need to have like maybe some more thinking on how you actually have revenue with strong retention.
The data point that really supports this, that these protocols can become that kind of infrastructure, I think, is going to DeFiLlama.com, look at what the top projects are by TVL. They're the same ones they always were. They're Maker, Aave, Uniswap, the Curve. Lido is the new one because that's like an actually new thing that came in the new last cycle. And in last cycle, we did pump every single incentive you'd imagine into like forking and subsidizing all the variations. And yet you still have this result. And you can imagine, okay, if Maker is 10 times bigger, if Aave is 10 times bigger, like it gets more difficult to job. It gets more difficult every single like dollar you add to one of these things. So that would make me think that, okay, these do have that opportunity to become like really sticky infrastructure that's actually kind of difficult to displace.
I've got another, maybe even to dive into some of the nuance, and maybe let's actually use the example of the two protocols that we've been primarily referring to this whole episode, which would be Maker and Uniswap. So, there's actually a great post by Multicoin. I know they're struggling a little bit recently, but they put out some great content. And it was basically this idea that, protocol, like DAOs manage risk. And the more that you manage risk, the more unforkable you ultimately are. So like if you take the example of something like Uniswap, right? The competitive advantage that Uniswap has is liquidity. Liquidity begets liquidity, right? So right now they've got like an enormous amount of market share. They have the most liquidity on there, tightest spreads, etc. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you could imagine someone else is going to have the cold start problem of how do we get that liquidity. But if someone offers like tighter spreads or lower fees, if we eventually turn on the fee structure for Uniswap, you could imagine really mercenary traders or liquidity providers just hopping over there. There's like very low switching costs. On the other hand, trying to fork something like Maker is more difficult, particularly if it goes down the route of like real world assets, because there's an enormous amount of like very technical like underwriting of risk, right? That goes on in that protocol. And you can't, if you just fork it with a different set of code, you can't take all of the expertise and people that have like built up on the original protocol and just magically make it go over there. So like, do you agree with that kind of nuance? And do you think that some protocols are more susceptible to being forked than others?
I do agree with that framework that like taking on, or just the business is more complex in a way where it's not that Uniswap token holders are taking full risk of the Uniswap protocol in a way, because like if there is some reason why like the ETH USDC pair gets drained for funds with some hack, and like Uniswap holders are technically liable for that in like the implicit way, even if they're not explicitly so, because if either they make those users whole or like somehow they have to ensure that the trust in the system doesn't go to zero and people in the future will trade on it, and otherwise their token goes to zero, right? So they are always taking the risk. It's just that their risk is different from something like Maker, where the risk is more complex and where you really you have like lots of these different layers that are sort of like Maker, for example. The specifics are interesting, I think, where the stablecoin itself is kind of forkable in some ways because it's just the denomination of your leverage. And if it's just that, it can be replaced because you can just take like another system, take out dollar loans against your ETH and be fine with that. And you have like some cost of capital competition there. But the stuff that isn't forkable is if DAI is just integrated everywhere and it's an actual stable coin that's used for payments and lots of different things, and it has a liquid market on Aave and it has trading pairs on Uniswap. That stuff makes it like less forkable. So because it's a more complex system, has all these aspects about it. Like even Uniswap, you can think, how much is Uniswap forkable? Or maybe I should just go after the ETH USDC market and only that with incentives, because that's the biggest market. And I can just try to get that one market away. Like Uniswap isn't one thing, it's all these different markets, right? And they all have their different competitive dynamics. So you can even slice that one up like in different ways and try to attack Uniswap in like lots of interesting ways. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but it was like at least some rambling on run.
It did answer for me. Guys, we're starting to wind down here. I'd love to kind of get your thought of like the end game, so to speak, on DAOs. And maybe we can ultimately divide that in between, like, what are some of the improvements that you guys would like to see made, let's say, over the next like couple years, and then maybe we can zoom out to like much further down the line, what you think. And one question that we've been asking a lot on this series is, I think if you hear the way the community aspect of DAOs talked about like 1 year ago versus today, it would be very different. Where 1 year ago, there was an enormous focus on the community and engaging them, and it was this big competitive advantage. And now I think that maybe some of the shine has come off of the last bull market. People are kind of more talking a little bit, at least in the research of doing the show, about like, you got to run every little thing by the community, which is great. That's one of the great things about DAOs, that so many people can contribute. But also, like, good decision making is often by like putting fewer people in front of making decisions than more. So like I've sat in on a couple of, I'm thinking of this Twitter Spaces that I sat in on the other night, where I'm just watching this group get roasted, and basically they want to RFP out every single little decision, and I'm just thinking to myself like, man, that's pretty tough. I don't think that's necessarily the best way to do it. So I'd love to know how you think about kind of the pros and cons of each of these DAOs having this super positive and like engaged community, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you'd want to separate the decision making maybe into like three types of decisions. Like the first is these extremely big, significant decisions, like a decision to deploy a protocol on another chain, a decision to to do an upgrade from V2 to V3, a decision to have some major change to say Aave's safety module, to to change the protocol in some significant way, to maybe set up a grants program, like those type of decisions where you have on-chain governance or something like that. I think then on the other extreme, you have sort of decisions that capital allocation decisions that can be much smaller and made much quicker, and be made by people with much higher context. And so people who can make a decision on we should sort of fund this team or the service provider, and it's not a ginormous amount of the treasury, but it's within our budget, and we're like risk specialists, we have the highest context on which risk vendor to choose, and so that I think should be made by sort of either full-time people in the DAO or high context contributors. And I think you have the middle, which is something that maybe there'll be a little more innovation on, which don't fall in both those categories, where it doesn't benefit from on-chain governance and also doesn't benefit from a team of 5 people deciding. And maybe in some cases that's like light token holder involvement, maybe like you have hundreds of thousands of higher context contributors. These might be voters or others that vote on some of these allocations, or Nouns has an interesting model called Prop House, where every month they have a certain amount of ETH that's allocated to contributors that put up interesting projects that they want to fund, and Nouns holders can vote on it. So some innovations in that mid space, but yeah, I think generally you see either like too much of a bias in some cases to the on-chain governance for everything, or too much of a bias towards a few people doing everything. And I think you just want to contextualize which decisions need on-chain governance and which decisions need a 5-person team kind of that has high context working on it.
The community aspect to me is like both overrated and underrated. I think it's like overrated in the bull market sense of how many people you have on Discord, like being excited, pumping the project. But if you think, for example, like from MakerDAO's perspective, important part of the community, like I think the protocol and token holders there should set risk limits on what people can build on top, and let those people like flourish, and that's the real community. So Centrifuge is like the real important community for MakerDAO, because they're like interfacing with the MakerDAO protocols, bringing real world like finance to it, and they're an important community contributor really, and you want to give those people a great opportunity to build their business on top of this, and you at the protocol level are making sure that you're taking intelligent risks with regards to how much like leeway you give them. But that kind of community to me is very important, and you want to see. And I think, like, for example, all the Gauntlet and Llama and others who work on Aave, that's the important part of the community, because they're like actually really contributing and being in there and making like their business, but also like Aave, for example, as a business better. So that's the kind of community framing that I like more than sort of the number of people on Discord anyway.
Maybe like zooming out almost like to sort of an annoying degree, right? Like the vast majority of people today are employed by traditional startups or corporations or whatever the companies across the world. Do you see a future, let's say 20, 30, 50 years from now, where it's more split and maybe half people like kind of contribute in a sort of part-time manner to these DAOs? Do you think people continue to work in companies, but many people contribute to DAOs on the side? Like, how do you think ultimately the balance of work ends up balancing out here?
I think the 40-50 year question is hard to answer. I'd say over the next 5 or 10 years, I think the um, number of people that contribute to protocols and DAOs will increase quite a bit, but I don't think that will compare to the number of people working at Google or Facebook. I think it's just much more so that you'll have uh, people who you'll have many more people that can earn a full-time income contributing to protocols. I think there's especially like a subset of highly skilled workers, whether on the sort of programming side or the risk side or the DeFi financial side, that will have doors open up. Like right now, it's extremely hard to contribute directly to one of these protocols, but it'll become easier through various other organizations, or there'll be structures of these DAOs that make it easier. And so I think that number will increase. It's hard to put what that number will be, because it's kind of contention on like just how many protocols there are, and how big that grows. But I think it'll be several multiples of what it is today in the next 5 or 10 years. But I also don't think it's these protocols don't require like you kind of have this bifurcation of people, right, where you don't need like a 5,000 person full-time group working for Uniswap protocol or Aave, right? That's just not how it works. It's just much more, you have these smaller units of individuals and contributors that can tag team and contribute to a few protocols. Maybe they focus on lending protocols and they have some expertise that carries over. Maybe they work for service providers, that work for DAOs. And you'll have like maybe a bridge too, which is you have a little more of the traditional entities as well engaging with DAOs, and there's ways that people contribute maybe more indirectly.
I agree with that a lot. Maybe my answer is a fun one related to that, but I would imagine there are like these stories of, I think there's like at one point one dude who was working on like a very important SSL infrastructure that the whole world used, and if that guy had like died, well, who knows what would have happened. I'm not sure if that story is entirely true, but directionally those are the kind of cases. And you can think, how many core contributors does Bitcoin have? It's like very few, but Coinbase has a lot, right? So the businesses on top that build and I think ultimately a lot of these protocols will end up in a similar situation where it's just a one guy saving SSL kind of situation. But then on top, because more and more, hopefully if any of this works, more and more businesses will interface with blockchain. That means that those companies will have a lot of people, but the core protocols themselves don't. So maybe that's a fun answer for 20 years from now.
And Mika's find made me think of, there's a book by Nadia Ekbal called Working in Public. It's on the maintenance of open source software, where she actually talks about how different founders of open source projects said that when the project got a lot of attention and everyone wanted to contribute, it actually was annoying for the founders, because the quality of contributions really reduced, and they have to now deal with management and maintenance of all these people. And so there's a fine line between what you want, like high quality contributions, but you don't necessarily need like 1,000 people trying to sort of comment on improvements of your staking contract or something. I think it's that's suitable for certain types of contributions. Maybe like bug bounties in crypto have that place for like a marketplace if like really any number of people can come and spot a bug. But that's a very organized sort of situation where people can contribute. For high context contributions, it's just very few people can actually drive value to a protocol.
Yeah, actually, we found this. This was one of our employees gave me this feedback one time, and it was a transformative bit of advice, which was, we were arguing about something a while ago. It's like a design decision or something like that, and someone was weighing in that shouldn't have, and was trying to mediate this disagreement. And the advice that was given to me is like, well, people basically, not everyone should weigh in on every decision, because that actually makes it much worse, right? The people that have expertise on a specific decision, they should be given more autonomy, and then on the margin, you'll make better decisions going forward. So I kind of keep that in the back of my head as well, that actually oftentimes if you want good decisions being made as a leader, you want to try to find out like who should ultimately have authority and say, and how can we actually limit the amount of influence occasionally on decisions and such. But guys, we're nearing the end of our time here. You guys have been super generous. I've really enjoyed this episode. If people want to find out more about like your work or follow you or whatever, like what's the best way to either get in contact or follow you guys?
Yeah, enjoyed the chat. I'm Hello Shreyas on Twitter, HELLOSHREYAS, and I'm a co-founder at Llama. So we're at Llama on Twitter, or llama.xyz, where you could follow our work, and we contribute a lot to protocols and DAOs. So yeah, if people have any thoughts or questions on some of these ideas, would love to chat with them.
I'm at M Honkasalo on Twitter, and I write a mediocre Substack as well, and mhonkasalo.substack.com. So feel free to subscribe and enjoy that.
It's a good Substack. You're being modest, Mika. All right, guys, this has been a ton of fun. Thanks very much. We'll have to do it again sometime soon.